Lincoln's Second American Revolution, which James McPherson wrote, called Lincoln's Second American Revolution. And he was a revolutionary figure, but I think he was much of a different kind of revolutionary figure than the James McPhersons of the world think of. And so I put together a list of things that I think are what Lincoln's revolution really involved. You know, what was being revolted against here anyway, if the mainstream authors are talking about Lincoln's revolution. And the first thing is a revolution of against the Jeffersonian idea that governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed. It was a revolution against consent of the governed, after all, because the South no longer consented to being governed by Washington, D.C., and Lincoln waged war to deny them that right of consent. And northern newspapers understood this at the time. The Bangor, Maine Daily Union wrote on November 13th, 1860, this. It said, "The Union depends for its continuance on the free consent and will of the sovereign people of each state, and when that consent and will is withdrawn on either part, their Union is gone." And this type of view was expressed all throughout the northern newspapers at the time. There's a big 2-volume set of newspaper articles called Northern Editorials on Secession that I quote in my book, and it contains dozens of articles like this. The New York Journal of Commerce, for example, said in January 12, 1861, "Opposing secession changes the nature of government from a voluntary one in which the people are sovereigns to a despotism where one part of the people are slaves to the federal government." They didn't say, "I'm adding to the federal government." That's what they're slaves to. And so this was widely believed at the time. And so that's why I argue in my book that Lincoln did not save the Union, as everybody is told. He destroyed the Union because the Union of the Founding Fathers was a voluntary union. They held political conventions to vote up or down. Think about it. Would the Founding Fathers have supported the Constitution if it was their understanding that if any state were ever to withdraw from that voluntary union, as they saw it, that the central government would therefore have the right to conscript an army and send it down to their state and kill 1 out of 4 adult males, bomb their cities, plunder their farms, burn down their businesses, and generally rape, pillage, and plunder their way through the state. It would have been insanity to think that James Madison and Hamilton and the rest would think that was the understanding at the time of the ratification of the Constitution in the minds of the Founding Fathers. And in fact, even Hamilton, as big a centralizer as he was, wrote about how it would be unthinkable for a central government to ever invade a state. I quote him in my book as talking about the issue of debt collection. What if the state doesn't pay any debts that it owes to the central government? And even Hamilton said, well, it'd be unthinkable, unimaginable that they would ever do this. So did Tocqueville, the famous French critic of American society, in his explanation of this system. And so the sort of little parable that I use to explain how Lincoln saved the Union in my speeches is to say that, well, it's sort of similar to how a man saves his marital union if his wife leaves him, and he goes out and finds her, drags her back into the home, chains her to the bedpost, and threatens to shoot her and burn the house down if she leaves again. The union has been saved. They're back together again. Yes, you can, in Lincolnian lawyerly language, the union is back together again. It has been saved. But it's not the same union that it was on their wedding day. It's a totally different kind of a union. And so that's how he saved it. He saved the Union geographically, but not philosophically. Philosophically, he destroyed the Union of the Founding Fathers. And there should be no pretense that the war was waged because the slaves had no consent. This is one of the red herrings that Harry Jaffa and his minions throw out, that they had this theory that the slaves were kidnapped. But they were slaves before the war, and they were slaves during the war, so there's no kidnapping going on. The implication of this word kidnapping is that, well, they were on the verge of being freed at any moment, and the South seceded so that this great movement to free the slaves could not succeed. That didn't happen. Lincoln was very clear on this. When he explained to Horace Greeley why the war, he said this in his famous letter to Horace Greeley on August 22nd, 1862, "My paramount objective in the struggle is to save the Union, and is not either to save or destroy slavery. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. If I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that. What I do about slavery and the colored race, I do because I believe it helps save the Union." Congress said the same thing. They declared to the world the purpose of the war. And the Congress said on July 22nd, 1861, "Resolved that this war is not prosecuted upon our part in any spirit of oppression," kind of a big lie there, huh? "Nor for any purpose of conquest or subjugation, nor purpose of overthrowing or interfering with the rights or established institutions of those states." And so they clearly said, hey, this war has nothing to do with slavery. And it didn't. The invasion had nothing to do with that. It was save the Union was what they said. And so it was a war against consent, the notion of consent. The brilliant Baltimore writer H.L. Mencken has a great essay on this, and I think Lou Rockwell reprinted it on his website, lourockwell.com, if you want to find it quickly on this, where he does point out that it was the South that was fighting for consent, and that the Gettysburg Address got it all backwards. That it was the North who was that was fighting to deprive the South of government by consent, not the other way around. Another aspect of this is that I argue that Lincoln's revolution was a revolution against the Constitution of the Founding Fathers, and you just have to look at his behavior. And very few Americans have ever heard of any of this, of anything about what Lincoln did with regard to the Constitution while in office. But I might as well let you in on the fact that a lot of the scholars, though, over the years, over the decades, have referred to Lincoln as a dictator. And how many people remember what part of the United States Constitution allows for a dictator? Raise your hand. Nobody? I'm surprised. Clinton Rossiter, who taught history at Cornell for many years, wrote that dictatorship played a decisive role in the North's successful effort to maintain the Union by force of arms. One man was the government of the United States. Lincoln was a great dictator and a true Democrat. End quote. Could you possibly get more contradictory words in one sentence? A dictator and a Democrat. And he wrote a whole book called Constitutional Dictatorship, where he said this. And he also said this: Lincoln's amazing disregard for the Constitution was considered by nobody as legal. End quote. James Ford Rhodes, another famous Northern historian. Most university libraries probably still have his big multi-volume history of the United States on the stacks somewhere. He said, "Never had the power of a dictator fallen into safer and nobler hands," about Lincoln. And he says, "If Lincoln was a dictator, it must be admitted that he was a benevolent dictator." End quote. So it's always amazing to me, these smart people, highly educated, smart people, don't sit there and think, well, I wonder if someone from Louisiana in 1866 would think Lincoln was a great dictator. And who are they referring to? It must be admitted. By whom? Who must admit this? It's a great, yeah, by the winners of the war are all that counts. They're the only people that count. So the generations of historians, even pro-Lincoln historians, readily have admitted that he was a dictator or acted like a dictator. But he was a good dictator, and the ends justify the means, is essentially the argument they make. And why do they say that? Well, he launched a military invasion without the consent of Congress, blockaded southern ports without first declaring war. He unilaterally suspended the writ of habeas corpus, which is our basic protection against governmental tyranny. It allowed him to have the military get people, drag them out of their homes, put them in prison without any due process at all. And there were, the mainstream Lincoln scholars say the number of northern civilians that this happened to was 13,000. But I've run across a Columbia University Law Journal article said that it was closer to 30,000. And even that is probably an underestimate of how many northern civilians. These were not enemy combatants. These were, or Southerners. These were northern civilians that were put in various gulags in the North. There's a great book on this is James Randall, who James McPherson calls the preeminent Lincoln scholar of the last generation, wrote a book called Constitutional Problems Under Lincoln. So if you want to read how a Lincoln defender actually lays this all out, all this information is in there. That's one source. Another good source is a book by Dean Sprague called Freedom Under Lincoln. And this is even better because it lists many of the newspapers that were shut down by the Lincoln administration. He shut down over 300 opposition newspapers in the North, and in some cases the editors and owners were imprisoned, and in some cases the printing presses were destroyed in the North. And here's what Dean Sprague says about this. Dean Sprague is also a Lincoln defender. He outlines all of this and more. I'm going to talk about more, but his last chapter is titled Lincoln the Humanitarian. And so he calls him a humanitarian for doing all these things. But here's how he describes the legal regime in the North during the war. He says, the laws were silent, indictments were not found, testimony was not taken, judges did not sit, juries were not impaneled, convictions were not obtained, and sentences were not pronounced. The Anglo-Saxon concept of due process, perhaps the greatest political triumph of the ages and the best guardian of freedom, was abandoned, end quote. And so that's what the great humanitarian did. Imagine this. Imagine if President Bush today sent one of his generals this order, one of the military generals, that said, you will take possession by military force of the printing establishments of the New York Times and the Washington Post and prohibit any further publication thereof. You are therefore commanded forthwith to arrest and imprison the editors, proprietors, and publishers of the aforesaid newspapers. Hold your applause, please. But that's a direct order to General John Dix, the strutting general who lobbied for the railroads, to shut down the Journal of Commerce and the New York World newspapers in New York City. And this is one example, but Randall says there were over 300. The number he puts is over 300 newspapers like this that were shut down for being opposition newspapers. So the First Amendment was destroyed during the course of the war in the northern states. All telegraph communication was censored. Railroads were nationalized. Federal troops interfered with northern elections. David Donald, who writes very favorably of Lincoln, in one of his books, he says that Lincoln won New York State in 1864 by 7,000 votes, quote, with the help of federal bayonets. And he writes about how federal soldiers would intimidate the Democrat voters and make sure the Republican voters would get to the polls. The Lincoln administration allowed soldiers in the field to vote at whatever state they happened to be in, even if they were not residents of that state. There's even an article in a journal called Defense Economics, written by an old friend of mine, Bob Tollison, who's at the University of Mississippi now. He was a colleague of mine at George Mason some years ago, that documents how Lincoln's furlough policies around election time was to furlough the Republicans and keep the Democrats in the trenches in some parts of the country. It's in Defense Economics around 1989, something like that. It was a journal article. One of the most outrageous things was Congressman Clement Vallandigham from Ohio, who had just resigned to run for governor of Ohio and was the most outspoken Democrat in Congress, was deported. And I'm going to explain a little bit more about that in a minute. The border states were systematically disarmed in violation of the Second Amendment. And in fact, the entire invasion of the South was an abolition of the Second Amendment, because the main reason James Madison gave in the Federalist Papers for the Second Amendment, making the case for the right to bear arms, was that an armed populace would be a deterrent to a federal invasion. It's right in there in the Federalist Papers, James Madison. Well, Lincoln proved him wrong. The populace was armed, but they invaded anyway. But they made sure that they systematically disarmed the border states while they could, in violation of the Second Amendment. There were confiscation acts, 2 different confiscation acts that applied to the North as well as the South. And I have copies of this law. I don't bring them with me, but I have quotes from the law. And you could have all of your personal property confiscated for a big, long list of things, of actions that you did, including this, quote, falsely exalting the motives of the traitors. If you were overheard in public as being saying, well, maybe there is a right of secession after all, then I would imagine you could be convicted of that, of falsely exalting the motives of the traitors and have all your personal property confiscated by the government. Or, this is the exact quote from the law, overstating the success of our adversaries. I suppose that means if you were ever overheard saying, boy, we really got our asses kicked at Manassas, didn't we? You could have all your personal property confiscated. And a particularly charming part of Lincoln's confiscation law was that if a person turned in someone who was overheard of saying one of these things, and they were convicted, then that person who turned him in could keep 50% of the person's property. So and so that was a particularly charming aspect. This was very similar to how the East Europeans operated. That's how they had the police state in Bulgaria and places like that under communism. They paid people to inform on their fellow citizens and gave them an incentive. They believed in capitalism a little bit, even the communists did. So Dean Sprague writes about how the only place in the North where there was genuine free speech was inside the prisons, where all the people who had been thrown in prison for free speech could now speak up. Because what do they have to lose? They're already in prison. In Fort Lafayette in New York Harbor was one of the more notorious gulags that the Lincoln administration had, where they would throw the kind of people that were put in there were many ordinary citizens that were just overheard saying things that might have been negative against the Lincoln administration, local government officials, business people, newspaper editors. The grandson of Francis Scott Key was thrown into the gulag at Fort McHenry in Baltimore. He was a newspaper editor in Baltimore at the time. His name was Francis Key Howard. And he had been writing editorials in opposition to the suspension of habeas corpus, and for that he was dragged out of his home, thrown into Fort McHenry, not too far from where his grandfather wrote the Star-Spangled Banner. And so there are people from all walks of life in the in the border states, who were thrown into prison. In my own state of Maryland, about 20 members of the state legislature, Mayor Henry May or Congressman Henry May from Baltimore, the mayor of Baltimore, they were all thrown in prison because before they could meet and vote on secession at the beginning of the war, the legislature fled to Frederick, Maryland from Annapolis. Lincoln's army surrounded Frederick and went house to house and captured almost all of them and put them in prison. And keep in mind, the Constitution requires the central government to see to it that each state has a Republican form of government. That's in the Constitution. And here's the Lincoln administration imprisoning duly elected members of the state legislature, of Congress, and a mayor. And so, no wonder he was called a dictator. So that happened. Now, as far as Vallandigham is concerned, Vallandigham made these stirring speeches in the House of Representatives when he was still in the House in opposition to all this. And some of the things he said, he condemned the Lincoln administration's, quote, persistent infractions of the Constitution and its high-minded usurpations of power, which were designed as a deliberate conspiracy to overthrow the present form of federal Republican government and to establish a strong centralized government in its stead. That's what Vallandigham was saying. He said, starting a war without the consent of Congress, he says, quote, is an act that would have cost any English sovereign his head at any time in the last 200 years. And then Vallandigham also, he says, all of these things were done not to save the Union, but to advance the cause of national banks and permanent public debt, high tariffs, heavy direct taxation, enormous expenditure, gigantic and stupendous peculation, pork barrel politics, the railroads, and strong government. No more state lines and a consolidated monarchy or vast centralized military despotism. Sounds like the Bush administration, doesn't it? It sounds like what we ended up with today. This is what Vallandigham was saying on the floor of the House of Representatives. And he went back home to run for governor. He was saying pretty much the same thing. Lincoln and his administration accused him of encouraging soldiers to defect or to go AWOL with these speeches. And in Lincoln's clever use of rhetoric, and so they deported. They had 67 armed federal soldiers broke into Vallandigham's house in April of 1863 and dragged him off to Tennessee. And this was another clever propaganda ploy that they wanted to make. They wanted to make the point that all of these critics of the administration were traitors. So we're going to bring him to Tennessee and hand him over to a Confederate commander because he's one of them anyway. He's a spy, traitor. But the Confederates didn't want to have anything to do with Vallandigham. Vallandigham actually wanted a peaceful reuniting of the two sections, but this was not going to happen. The Confederates, after being invaded for 2 years, were not interested. And so he ended up going into exile in Canada and spending the rest of the time in Canada. And the Ohio Democratic Party still gave him their nomination, their gubernatorial nomination, even though he was in Canada and had no chance of winning. And then the Lincoln administration was still not done with him. The propaganda arm of the Republican Party, the Union League, started spreading these stories that Vallandigham was sort of like the Wizard of Oz up there in Canada, behind a curtain, pulling strings and pushing buttons and orchestrating the New York City draft riots. He's the one who convinced Robert E. Lee to invade Pennsylvania, leading to the Battle of Gettysburg, supposedly. And so they made all these wild stories of the Wizard of Oz up there pulling the strings, giving Robert E. Lee commands. A Democrat congressman from Ohio, giving orders to Robert E. Lee. But the gullible Northern public, enough of them anyway, probably believed it. And these stories are repeated today by Harry Jaffa and all his toadies. I was on a radio debate with one of them, and he repeated all these. Well, Vallandigham was a spy. He was orchestrating the New York draft riots from New York City. They still repeat these things. But there's a man named Frank Clement, spelled with a K, K-L-E-M-E-N-T, who was sort of the historian of the Copperheads. The Lincoln administration named the Democratic opposition in the North Copperheads, snakes in the grass. Copperhead is a snake in the grass. And Clement was probably the best-known scholar in the last 50 years or so of the Copperheads. And he wrote a book called Lincoln's Critics that pretty much disproves all of this. It's not hard to disprove it, but Vallandigham did not orchestrate the New York City draft riots. He did not give orders to Robert E. Lee to invade Pennsylvania and these wild things. This all came from the Union League. And I mentioned last night there was an article in Insight magazine, December 23rd, 2004, by Michael Waller, entitled "When Does Politics Become Treason?" where he makes the case that today some congressional opponents of the war in Iraq might be committing treason and perhaps should be imprisoned, if not executed, because that is the penalty for treason, execution. You qualify for that. And he uses Vallandigham as his Exhibit A. He says, well, if the sainted Abraham Lincoln did it, maybe President Bush should consider doing this. And Waller apparently he says this at the end of his article. He says, given the recent controversy about the authenticity of quotations attributed to Abraham Lincoln, and he wasn't referring to me. There was an article in Time magazine about some famous Lincoln quotes that are fake. In my new book, I have a whole chapter called Fake Lincoln Quotes. The quotes have been proven to be fakes by their scholar. But anyway, he says, in light of this controversy, he says, Insight went directly to the primary source for the presidential statements about how to deal with congressmen who sabotage the war effort, end quote. And what is the primary source? It's an 1863 publication entitled "The Truth from an Honest Man, the Letter of the President," published and distributed by the Union League. So that's where he got his truth about the Vallandigham story. the Union League. It's just remarkable that whenever I want the truth about economic policy, you know where I go? The Republican National Committee and the Democratic National Committee. That's where I go to find truth. That's all the time. So you see that the constitutional implication of this was a destruction of the separation of powers. If you can intimidate your foremost critic in Congress like this, it sends a pretty strong message to all other members of Congress that if you're a little too critical of what we're doing here, this could happen to you too. So I think that was another blow to the separation of powers. Now, about half a mile down the street from my office in Baltimore is a statue of Roger B. Taney, the former Chief Justice of the United States. He was from Baltimore. And Taney, at the time, issued an opinion that the suspension of habeas corpus was unconstitutional, because he said only Congress has that right. If you read the Constitution, it does allow for the suspension of habeas corpus, but it's under congressional powers, not executive powers. And he cited Supreme Court precedents, he cited British law, and other things. And Lincoln ignored him. He issued this opinion as a circuit court judge. Supreme Court judges were circuit court judges at the same time, and back in those days. And Lincoln also issued an arrest warrant for Judge Taney. And there are 4 good sources of documentation of this. And source number 1 was a man who worked for Lincoln in the White House. His name is Lehman. He was also one of Lincoln's law partners before the war, Ward Lehman. And in his autobiography, it's not really an autobiography, it's sort of like a history of the war, he talks about the arrest warrant for Judge Taney, but how apparently they couldn't find a federal marshal with the guts to drag the 83-year-old Chief Justice out of his chambers and throw him in Fort McHenry along with Frank, the grandson of the author of the Star-Spangled Banner. And so they didn't actually serve it. But the Lincoln cult has responded to this claim by saying, well, Ward Lehman was a drunk. You can't really rely on a drunk. Of course, Ulysses S. Grant was a famous drunk too, but you can rely on every word he ever said. But as an aside, I've had one of the things that's happened since the publication of my book is I have research assistants all over the world now for free that I don't unpaid. And there's a guy writing a doctoral dissertation at George Mason University that hounded the Huntington Library until they gave him the microfilm of Ward Lehman's book, which they stonewalled Charles Adams on. Charles Adams could not get it out of them. And so he has this, and he's putting it up on the internet right now. He's in the process of putting the whole thing up on the internet. And there's a lot of really damning information. He sends me tidbits every once in a while. But this, Joe Stromberg will love this. This is a real good find. He digs around for obscure things like that. But Charles told me he was totally stonewalled by the Huntington Library. Yeah, there are a number of other corroborating sources, though. One of them, there's a history of the U.S. Marshal Service written by Frederick Calhoun, talks about the arrest warrant. There's an 1887 book written by George W. Brown, the wartime mayor of Baltimore, who talks about his interview with Judge Taney, where Judge Taney told him that there was an arrest warrant for me. So Taney knew there was an arrest warrant. Yet another source is the autobiography of Benjamin Robbins Curtis. Benjamin Robbins Curtis was the U.S. Supreme Court Justice who wrote the dissenting opinion in the Dred Scott case. And he wrote, in his autobiography, he writes about the arrest warrant for Judge Taney, which he calls, in his words, quote, a great crime. And the name of the book is A Memoir of Benjamin Robbins Curtis. Okay, so there are 4 different sources now of very reputable people, including the Chief Justice, or not Chief, the Justice who wrote the dissenting opinion in the Dred Scott case. Curtis also represented Andrew Johnson in his impeachment trial before the Senate. So this is not just some guy who wrote a book about the Marshal Service that did this. There's also evidence that I've dug up that this was a common practice. This just didn't happen to Taney. It happened to other federal judges who issued writs of habeas corpus, which would allow people to have due process. And here's one example. If anybody is really interested, I can give you the actual legal references here. Murphy versus Porter, 1861, is one of them. There was a letter. This is from the National Archives. A letter from a federal judge named W.M. Merrick, and he wrote this letter to his colleagues, explaining why he didn't show up in court to serve a writ of habeas corpus to a young man that had been imprisoned by the Lincoln administration. He says this: "After dinner, I visited my brother judges in Georgetown, and returning home between 7:30 and 8 o'clock, I found an armed sentinel stationed at my door by order of the provost marshal. I learned that this guard had been placed at my front door as early as 5 o'clock. So he's explaining to his colleagues that the Lincoln administration sent provost marshals to his home to essentially place him under house arrest so that he could not go to court and serve the writ of habeas corpus, which would allow this young man to have due process in court. He had to go to prison. And so, I've run across several letters like this, which sort of implies to me that Taney wasn't the only one. And again, the constitutional implication of this is the destruction of the separation of powers, the intimidation of the judicial branch. If he's willing to issue an arrest warrant for the Chief Justice, certainly federal circuit court judges are small potatoes compared to that. And so again, that's why, one of the secret reasons why the Lincoln dictatorship, the word Lincoln dictatorship, is known. The Lincoln scholars know all this, but they never bring it up, and anyone who does, they try to smear them. Another aspect of Lincoln's war on the Constitution is what I call Lincoln's big lie. Don Livingston has called it Lincoln's spectacular lie, or aspects of this. And it was mentioned last night. Lincoln borrowed from Joseph Story and Daniel Webster the false theory that the Constitution and the government was created by the whole people. Something called the whole people, and not the citizens of the free, independent, and sovereign states. And if that's true, then no such thing as state sovereignty ever existed, and no state had a right to secede if there was no sovereignty. But history proves this wrong. History proves this wrong. It's not hard to prove this wrong. They typically point to the preamble of the Constitution, which reads, "We, the people of the United States, do ordain and establish this Constitution." We, the people. But James Madison, in his notes on the debates in the Federal Convention, explained why this language is there, "We, the people." The original said, "We, the people of the states of New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Providence Plantations, Connecticut, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania," on and on and on. It did name all the individual states, but then they said, well, wait a minute, these states have not all ratified the Constitution yet. We can't list all the states individually as saying this is our Constitution. We don't know. They might not all ratify the Constitution. So they changed it to "We, the people," for that reason. But the truth is, they did think of this in terms of we the citizens of the free, independent, and sovereign states. James Madison himself, who was successful in getting himself named Father of the Constitution, he campaigned for that, just like George Washington campaigned to be father of his country, I guess. But he's taken seriously, he should be. He said on how the Constitution would be ratified, in his notes, he said, quote, "by the people composing those political societies of the states in their highest sovereign capacity." So the whole people had nothing to do with the creation of the Constitution. Lincoln's assertion in the Gettysburg Address that a new nation was created in 1776 is wrong. They created a confederacy of states. They didn't create a nation, a new nation. That's 13 separate countries formed a confederation. Read the concluding paragraph of the Declaration of Independence. What does it say? "These colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states. They have full power to levy taxes, conduct war, conclude peace, contract alliances, establish commerce, and to do all other acts and things which independent states may of right do." They created 13 independent countries. And they wanted to, anyway, with the Declaration of Independence. all of the founding documents, the Articles of Confederation, the treaty with Great Britain. King George signed a treaty with all the individual states. He didn't sign it with something called the United States. And in fact, you will not find the words United States is anywhere in the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, Articles of Confederation, none of the founding documents. It's always the United States are, signifying that the free and independent states are united in creating this confederacy. It's not some unitary thing. The father of the Constitution, Madison also said, the Constitution will be ratified not as individuals, by people, not as individuals composing one entire nation, but as composing the distinct and independent states to which they respectively belong. It doesn't get any more clearer than that. And so this was another revolution against state sovereignty. And another part of the Lincoln's Revolution was really a revolution against the very form of government that was created by the Constitution as described by Madison in terms of divided sovereignty, the system of divided sovereignty that was created. There's a political philosopher named Gottfried Dietze, D-I-E-T-Z-E, who wrote a great little book called America's Political Dilemma, From Limited to Unlimited Democracy. He taught at Johns Hopkins for many years. And there's like a great single sentence here that explains what the founders meant by divided sovereignty. Federalism, instituted to enable the federal government to check oppressions by governments of the states, and vice versa, appears to be a supreme principle of the Constitution. So the states were empowered to protect the citizens against tyranny of the central government and vice versa. So the central government was given certain responsibilities, in their view, to protect citizens from tyranny, because the purpose of government, after all, to the believers in natural rights, was to protect the lives, liberties, and properties of the people. That's why we have government, whether it's central or a state and local. And Dietze goes on to say this. He says, before the Civil War, the nature of American federalism was still a subject of debate. The outcome of the Civil War ended that debate. The nationalists emerged as victors. National power increased as the 20th century approached, along with the disappearance of states' rights. That period of history was characterized by an increasing interference with economic freedom and constitutes a constitutional revolution that can be well termed a reversal of the Revolution of 1787. Okay, and Woodrow Wilson wrote very approvingly on this. Woodrow Wilson was a political science professor at Princeton before he became president, and he wrote a book on congressional government, and he wrote very approvingly. He wrote this. He said, the war between the states established this principle, that the federal government is, through its courts, the final judge of its own powers, end quote. And of course, that is exactly what the states' rights advocates feared beginning with, before Jefferson's time. Even the people who wrote, I think other people have mentioned Jefferson, St. George Tucker, who wrote the great book, A View of the Constitution. That is the Jeffersonian view of the U.S. Constitution. Senator John Taylor from Virginia, Tyranny Unmasked, one of his books. You'll see this in there. The argument was, if the day ever comes when the federal government becomes the sole arbiter of the limits of its own powers, then sure enough, it will inevitably decide that there are no limits to its own powers. And that's right. Yeah, that's where we are today. Yeah, you can think of land for anything. And so I used to give the example. I'll have to think up a new example, but of just to bring home this point that that's where we are today. That there are no limits to federal power anymore. There used to be state-imposed limits. Is back when Bill Clinton fired Joycelyn Elders as his Surgeon General. Does anybody remember why Joycelyn Elders was fired by Bill Clinton? No, I think that was that. Yeah, her son was. Yeah, she advocated a federally funded masturbation education program, and that was even too much for Bill Clinton. And so this is true. This is why he fired her. But the point I'm trying to make is, if people in Washington think even that is a constitutional use of tax dollars, there are no limits to the constitutional use of tax dollars. Yeah, anything goes. But it wasn't always that way. It wasn't. There were strict limits, and the whole states' rights project, begins. Another one of the big lies that was perpetrated by the Lincoln administration, and still to this day by the Lincoln cult and Harry Jaffa and others, was that the idea of states' rights was invented by Calhoun purely as an excuse for slavery. And this is one lie that really galls me, because Jefferson's Kentucky Resolve of 1798 is the clearest explanation of the idea of states' rights. And these other authors I mentioned wrote about this. St. George Tucker proposed a law to abolish slavery in Virginia in the 1790s, and he was the author of this great book on the states' rights view of the Constitution. All states, North and South, believed in states' rights, because prior to 1865, it was not considered a settled issue that the Supreme Court would be the sole arbiter of constitutionality. There were plenty of people who believed the citizens of the states had an equal voice with the Supreme Court. So did Congress, and so did the president. When the Supreme Court said that a national bank was constitutional, Andrew Jackson responded by essentially saying, "Thanks for your opinion, but I disagree." It was only their opinion. He did not bow down and say, "Please let me kiss your feet, Justice Rehnquist," or anything like that, like we do today. Thank you for telling me how to live. The black robe deities, as Clyde Wilson calls them. That all came after 1865, as Woodrow Wilson pointed out. That's one of the things that was a consequence of Lincoln's revolution. But to give you some examples, in 1809, Jefferson had put a trade embargo because the British were confiscating American ships and sailors. And so he didn't know what to do. He put an embargo on shipping. And this was very damaging to the New England shipping business, as you would think. And so Massachusetts nullified the Embargo Act by denouncing it as, quote, unjust, oppressive, and unconstitutional. While this state maintains its sovereignty and independence, this is Massachusetts, all the citizens can find protection against outrage and injustice in the strong arm of state government. Connecticut did the same thing. They denounced the embargo as incompatible with the Constitution of the United States and encroaching upon the immunities of the state. So they thought that if a law came along that they thought was unconstitutional, they would not obey it, just like the South Carolinians did with regard to the 1828 Tariff of Abominations. Rhode Island says, it is our duty to interpose for the purpose of protecting our citizens from the ruinous inflictions of usurped and unconstitutional power. There were New England states. The War of 1812 broke out. New England effectively seceded by not participating in the War of 1812. They thought it was a dispute between Jefferson's party and Madison, and the British, and they refused to send militia. They engaged in all sorts of tricks, like putting men in debtors' prison so they couldn't be taken for the army, and then letting them out the next day, things like this. But the Connecticut Assembly issued this statement. They said, it must not be forgotten that the state of Connecticut is in big capital letters, free, sovereign, and independent state, that the United States are a confederated and not a consolidated republic. The governor of this state is under a high and solemn obligation to maintain the lawful rights and privileges thereof as a sovereign, free, and independent state. And so they refused to participate in the War of 1812. And this was Connecticut. So this states' rights was not a southern thing at all. There were northern states that nullified the Fugitive Slave Act. They resented having to spend their own money rounding up the slaves of southern slave owners. Some of these slaves were probably, or at least their parents of those slaves were probably sold to the southern plantations from some of the very same people in New England at the time. There was a New England secession movement after Jefferson was elected. The New England Federalists plotted for an entire decade to secede. They even held a secession convention in Hartford, Connecticut in 1814. They voted against it. But all during this time, there was no dispute over whether they had a right of secession. It was only, is this an economically and politically wise thing for us to do or not? But it wasn't. There was no dispute over whether they had a right to do this. And so, of course, nullification and secession are keystones of states' rights. and they were exercised by northern states and southern states until 1865. And so, I guess in conclusion there, by destroying the system of states' rights, we did create the consolidated monopolistic state. And tyrants throughout the 20th century, all the worst tyrants of the 20th century, were enemies of divided sovereignty or states' rights, no matter what you want to call it. You can call it any of these things. And after my debate with Harry Jaffa, I'll give you an example of how some of these people choose to debate. One of his remarks, if I can recall it correctly, was instead of directly discussing these issues, he said that he picked out some quote from some obscure ex-Nazi, an ex-Nazi, who turned into an academic after World War II, who supposedly said Hitler himself would have been on the side of the South in the Civil War. Hitler himself. And so this is Harry Jaffa's reputable source. It's in his book, his New Birth of Freedom, his latest book. What a novel title. And so on one hand, former Nazis are not the most reputable people to cite in your academic work. And my friend David Gordon pointed out to me that there is a lot of controversy over whether this actual cite is true or not. And so I got to thinking about that, and I think Joe Stromberg mentioned to me in passing that, in Mein Kampf, Hitler actually made some comments on states' rights, Hitler himself. And so when I got back from the debate, as soon as I got back, I just happened to have a copy of Mein Kampf on my shelf. My wife works in television. She did work at the Discovery Channel at the time, and she actually produced a 1-hour documentary on Hitler. So I bought her a copy of Mein Kampf to use for this documentary on Hitler. But I normally don't have it on my shelf where I pick it up and read it every day, first thing when I get to work, or anything like that. But turns out Adolf Hitler was a Lincolnite, big fan, huge fan, and. And there's a chapter in Mein Kampf where Hitler made the case for destroying all states' rights in Germany, because after all, you can't have totalitarianism unless you have monopoly government. We call it consolidated government here, but it's monopoly government. If people have divided sovereignty, if they can escape, they have a way out, they can vote with their feet. You can't be a totalitarian monopolist. And that's a bad thing in the eyes of the Adolf Hitlers of the world. So. Here's what Hitler said. He said he mocked what he called so-called sovereign states of Germany and condemned their, quote, impotence and fragmentation. He praised Otto von Bismarck for all but abolishing states' rights, and he said that this was a victory in the struggle between federalism and centralization. So you hear Hitler taking the Hamiltonian, the Hamilton, Clay, Lincoln side of the centralization issue. And he commented on American history in Mein Kampf. He said, this is Adolf Hitler speaking, the individual states of the American Union could not have possessed any state sovereignty of their own, for it was not these states that formed the Union. On the contrary, it was the Union which formed a great part of the so-called states. He has read Abraham Lincoln's speeches, obviously. This was Lincoln's theory. This was the whole people. This is Lincoln's whole people theory. Here's what Lincoln himself said in his first inaugural address. The Union is much older than the Constitution. It was formed, in fact, by the Articles of Association in 1774. It was matured and continued by the Declaration of Independence in 1776. It was further matured by the Articles of Confederation in 1778. And finally, in 1787, one of the declared objects for ordaining and establishing the Constitution was to form a more perfect union. So the Union is older than the states, as was Lincoln's theory in the first inaugural, and Hitler was paraphrasing the first inaugural. Where else would he have gotten this theory? And so, like I said, all the worst tyrants in world history are Lincolnites on the issue of centralized government versus decentralized government, even Adolf Hitler. And so, and you think about that, can a union of two things be older than either of the two things it is a union of? Right. That's like saying a marital union can be older than either spouse. Right. Is that possible? I mean, You forget about looking at it historically, what happened in American history. It's just a logical impossibility for this to be true. But that is the theory upon which the U.S. government today is based, that no right of secession ever existed. And so maybe I'll quit there by bringing to your attention that Adolf Hitler was a Lincolnite. I thought that would go over well at in this crowd.
Tom, one of the things that strikes me after attending all of these lectures, and particularly with yours, is the amount of deep research that's required to produce the framework to even have a decent argument with somebody on the other side.
Yeah.
And especially when they lie. Are you doing anything to trap all of what you've collected in this process into a database that might be available to other researchers or not?
Well, I'm not a socialist, Harry. I prefer to write it up as a book and have a commercial publisher sell it.
And that's a good thing, and I want you to have the first crack at that. But given the complexity of this, and there's so much information that is so hard to get to,
Yeah.
is there a way to somehow
there was an awful lot. Just the LouRockwell.com website. There are so many links. There are thousands of links if you look through all these articles on these issues and related issues. That there's a lot of information just up there that never was before. And I'm sure Don is working on his website in the next year or so. I assume that's going to be a major project of the Abbeville Institute. It ought to be to put as much as we can of this sort of information up there. I haven't. That would be a good project. I welcome anybody to do it because. Well, even things like Lincoln's own speeches. I'm constantly I'll quote one of his speeches, and somebody will say, "I didn't learn that in school. You're making it up. And where is this?" And so I end up being a research assistant. If I answer all this mail, there's just some bozo in Nevada will email me and demanding that I spend an hour digging up some reference for him, and just because he was too lazy to educate himself. So that's why I just don't do it. But even Lincoln's own speeches, putting that up on a CD-ROM or something would be online would be worthwhile, because as Clyde Wilson says, what a lot of these Lincoln scholars do is they'll pick a few of Lincoln's prettier sounding speeches and write entire books about elaborating on what he really meant by this or that line. And of course, every elaboration is an extreme exaggeration of what a saintly heart he has. That's another thing that always gets me about the Lincoln. They always claim to know what was in his heart, let alone his mind. I guess they know what is in his mind too, in his heart. Yeah.
What do you say to the statement that in the South and stated in the Union that they could call error?
Well, they obviously didn't think they could. They were outvoted in the 1824, beginning in 1824. They were grossly outvoted in the House and the Senate on that, and it was only the threat of secession, really, with South Carolina, I think, that helped them prevail. I think in 1833, and so I don't think they would have had the votes. Maybe they would have prevailed for another couple of years, but the population of the North was more than double, well, maybe close to triple the population of the South at the time.
22 million, I think.
Yeah.
22 million versus 9 million, something like that. So as far as congressional representation, even with the 3/5 clause, it was becoming pretty lopsided, and there were 11 states that seceded, so that's 22 senators. And I think there were 22 other states. So it's 44 senators, and the vote was always lopsided north and south on the tariff. So I don't think they had much hope that they could have prevailed on that. I also have written elsewhere that right before Lincoln was inaugurated, there were three bills proposed before Congress to outlaw secession. There's an article in the Stetson Law Review that I cite, it's in my book here in the paperback version, which raises the question: well, if secession was illegal, why was the Republican-dominated Congress proposing laws to outlaw secession if it was already illegal? Obviously, the answer was they knew darn well it was legal, and so that's why they proposed 3 separate laws to make it illegal right around March of 1861, right at the time Lincoln was taking power, and so.
Yeah, John, no less than John Marshall said that the prohibition of a right is a strong presumption of its existence.
That's right. Right. That's one of the famous lines. Yeah, the prohibition of a right is a strong assumption that that right must exist, for sure. I think this man had his hand up.
Well, if secession was talked about, if it was even considered, and they even had to outlaw it, what role would you say that industry had in trying to prevent secession and trying to centralize the government?
Well, I believe a very big role. Industry. I'm even more convinced than I was 2 years ago. After it's sort of encouraging to me that people like Michael Holt, who I cited, it's interesting that he's not a Lincoln scholar. He's a famous historian, but he's not a Lincoln scholar. Neither is this New York Times writer that I mentioned in my other talk. Independently come to the conclusion by just looking at the facts that it's a little more complicated than the usual story, that the opposition to the extension of slavery was all a part of the battle, the 70-year battle over political dominance between North and South, because it would have an effect on the number of votes in Congress in North and South. And why was this battle so important? Why was it important to keep a political balance between North and South? Or why, the flip side of that, why did the North want to dominate and outnumber the South politically? I'm sure there were Southerners who wanted to dominate the North too, but why were they do it? To do what? Once you got that power, what were you going to do? Well, they come right out and said what they wanted to do. I quoted that Congressman Joshua Giddings as saying, well, if we don't dominate, we can't get our tariff, we can't get our internal improvements and have a continental empire all the way to California, and we can't have a central bank to create the greatest nation on earth or whatever. They came out and said that. That's why, and that was industry. That was industry. There was the Whig Party and the Republican Party. They were always the party of big business, among other things. As Kerry said last night, the Republicans always had a gang of nuts also associated with them. But I think it's important also to understand that the free soil movement, which was a part of the Republican Party, they wanted free land, but they also wanted land that was free of black people. That's why they were so strong advocates of these laws that existed in Illinois and Indiana and elsewhere that made it illegal for black people to immigrate into those states. They wanted all white territories out there. So it wasn't only soil that was free of a price, it was free of black people. And I think that's one of the reasons why Lincoln got their support, because he was right in it. He was one of the managers of the Illinois Colonization Society, which procured money from the Illinois legislature to deport the black people, the free blacks that were in Illinois, out of Illinois. And so the Free Soilers thought, well, he's our guy. But the business, sure, the whole American system that I talked about, that was the unholy alliance between government and various businesses.